Good afternoon, fellow rejects. Today, we are going to investigate the intersection of intellectual and political history of freedom and liberty. How does freedom and liberty separate within the scholarship of early America? Believe it or not, freedom and liberty are not the same thing. Liberty is state-sponsored freedom under the umbrella of laws and adherence to those laws, where absolute freedom is more like being a berserker in the woods of Scandinavia or a mountain man in the Rocky Mountains. These are not the same thing. We're going to investigate scholarship in early America and liberty and the founding principles of the American experiment a little bit here. All right. The founding principles of the American experiment are thought to be rooted within the intellectual philosophy of various individuals from the Enlightenment period, such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. John Locke is extremely paramount in the founding of the Republic, as most of his works were referenced by our founders a lot. Rousseau, Voltaire. The concept of individual liberty, equal protection under the law, became paramount as man agreed to enter into the social contract and reject his or her absolute freedom in the wilderness of nature. Liberty was God's gift to mankind, all right, by way of inalienable rights, liberties that are God-given and cannot be taken away. These civil liberties belong to all men and were implemented under protection of the law and state. However, liberty, through reason, became the Trojan horse of oppression and tyranny, although probably unintentionally. Indigenous peoples in the New World were systematically hunted and destroyed by the enlightened of a distant land. The yoke of enslavement and death had a new and misleading name for the indigenous peoples of this world and for various other peoples, and that name was liberty. For us to truly understand why liberty became the rallying cry of the English Revolution during the English Revolution and the colonials during the American Revolution, we must first identify the origins of natural law and how man came into his covenant with civil society, how that happened. Understanding this origin story is critical to understanding the concept of liberty and the pursuit thereof. Thomas Hobbes' infamous work, Leviathan, published in 1651, developed the roots for English interest in man in his or her natural state. According to the work, man without civil society or proper government wields an existence that is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because of this, man forms social contracts, governments, and or civil societies for protection of himself, his family, and his property. Without this, man's existence becomes singular, survival. Okay. Various critiques of Hobbes' work have manifested over the last 50 years, primarily focused on his ideals towards religion, the ideal form of government, and what man was or is truly like in his or her most natural state, because that's something worth exploring based on his timeline and what man in his or her natural state actually looks like. Bailey Verrell wrote a critique titled A Critique of Hobbes' State of Nature, which is an intellectual history investigation into the origin of Hobbes' concepts of man in his natural state and social contract theory, which is a part of Hobbes. The question within the work is to analyze Hobbes' formulation of the state of nature and whether or not that calculation is accurate. Hobbes offers up three arguments or principles regarding man and his conflicts within the state of nature. 1, confidence, men destroy for individual gain. 2, diffidence, the pursuit of safety or security. And 3, glory, man's pursuit for reputation or status even. Verrell takes Hobbes to task here, and his key conclusions detail how humanity is much more complicated than his or her individual pursuit of materialism and glory, because that's really what we're talking about here. Through those three concepts is materialism and glory. These three concepts are an oversimplification of mankind and his desires. Man is not so insecure as to spend the better part of his 300,000 year existence exclusively in the hunt of only security and only glory. Hobbes was an advocate for materialism. Really quick coffee break here. No Slurpee sounds. Hard charging. All right. Hobbes was an advocate for materialism, as I said, the belief that only material things are real. Materialism is a paramount structural belief in democracy, in government, in the state, which we'll explore in a little bit here. This structured concept bled over into the works of other prominent Enlightenment thinkers that were very influential to the Puritans who were relocating to the New World, and the founding fathers that structured the foundational documents of the United States. For example, one of John Locke's most notable quotes in his work, The Second Treatise of Government, is, quote, "Being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Okay? This statement was reinterpreted by Thomas Jefferson to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when John Locke first talked about this, he talked about it in a more of a materialistic standpoint, life, liberty, and property or possessions. Where Thomas Jefferson changed it a little bit, he was a big reader of Locke, was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was then implemented or injected into the Declaration of Independence. Materialism, or the continuous hunt for material property and possessions, became inclusive with the pursuit of liberty. This is the concept of private property, right? Private property is extremely important to liberty. Vennerell does an adequate job pushing back on this, explaining why human behavior is just simply not this simple. Hobbes on Barbarism and Civilization, written by Robert Cranach, is a political history investigation into the origin of how Hobbes, specifically Hobbes, discovered how man is in his or her natural state. This is important because Hobbes' entire hypothesis and theory is based on man in his or her natural state. What does that mean? The question associated with the work is that Hobbes' claim has been founded improperly with inadequate historical evidence. He states he conducted his investigation. He determined the human era that Hobbes researched based on the totality of Hobbes' writings. Okay, this is important. So remember, Hobbes published his book in the mid-17th century, so mid-1600s, which was exclusively based on Hobbes' writings and like the humanity that he was able to investigate from the time of ancient Egypt to the 17th century England, which is the 1600s. So you're talking ancient Egypt, what was known about ancient Egypt in the 1600s, which still is not man in his natural state. Ancient Egypt is not man in his natural state if they were building pyramids. To the 17th century, the 1600s England. Okay, Egypt's history, and I said this in our last deal when we were talking about the Israel-Palestine land heritage argument. The Egyptian history is extensive, extraordinarily extensive. Most of it was little known even to the most educated humans of the 17th century, which is when Hobbes wrote Leviathan. His outcomes, Hobbes on Barbarism and Civilization, his outcome and his findings were the following. The sources used by Hobbes to make this determination were exclusively the great historians, poets, and philosophers of antiquity, and the lesser-known historians of contemporary Europe. However, it is critical to understand that Egyptian hieroglyphic writing did not become even comprehensible, understood at all to any extent for Europeans and basically all of humanity until the 1820s, till the 19th century. 200 years or 170 years after the publication of Leviathan. 170 years after the publication of Leviathan were we even able to read the Egyptian works. Okay? Therefore, Hobbes expanded on the pre-existing ideals notions regarding the Egyptians and their practices. Hobbes investigated Rome and other ancient empires through the writings of their philosophers and historians as well. However, when one is referring to the ideals of Rome, Greece, the monarchs of Christian Catholic Europe, and even ancient Egypt, One is investigating civilization, society, culture. One is not investigating a man in his or her natural state. These are the works that Hobbes investigated when he produced Leviathan. These are not works that describe man in his or her natural state. As if you were living in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, even ancient Egypt, you were not a man in his or her natural state, which is much more comparable, like I said, to a mountain man in the Rocky Mountains in like the 18th, 19th century, or a berserker in Scandinavia. That's much closer to man in his or her natural state. The closest source Hobbes used to discuss man in his or her natural state was the Old Testament, which is still mostly speaks of man within civilization. The Old Testament mostly, almost exclusively, still speaks to man, with a very few exceptions, such as Adam and Eve. To man in his or her, we're dealing with society. It's not man in his or her natural state, even in the Old Testament. And when man is discussed outside of civilization, it is usually a parable or a story, history intended to lead one towards the divine, right? All right, so his conclusions are fantastically executed. This is Cranix, and mirror the conclusions expressed by David Graeber in his book. And this is a freaking great book. If you get a chance, I highly recommend this book. It's called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber. Coffee break again. Again, no slipping sounds. Or slurping. Okay, Dawn of Everything. Graeber's work is a political and intellectual history that examines how Hobbes developed his conclusions regarding humanity and his or her natural state. Gruber argues that Hobbesians, those who espouse Hobbesian ideals, agree that before known civilizations began, humanity existed primarily in hunter-gatherer groups of nomadic peoples or tribes. Tribes, again, are not humans in their natural state. Tribes too small and underdeveloped to understand or implement real governance centered around the more modern ideals of liberty and law. They were incapable of developing true equality. Okay, that's how Hobbesians see it. Graeber argues that true equality is not found within the Hobbesian or Lockean forms of government, structured around the ideals of property, materialism, and possession. These ideals should be easily dismissed once one investigates and understands what the Age of Reason and Liberty did to the indigenous peoples of the United States and the Americas in general, to include African Americans, obviously. Property or land, wealth, gold and other metals, were the true worship god of the Puritan settlers within the American colonies, not the idea of equity under the law or the promotion of freely expressed religion. We have these rose-colored glasses to think that that's primarily what it was about. Absolutely about material possession and wealth, 100%. To better explain this theory, Gruber injects the idealist philosophy of a little-known Native American philosopher from the Great Lakes region of the Americas, or the Hurons. And they had a different name for themselves. I'll come up with it here in a minute. That individual was named Candironk. Candironk was a Huron chief that became famous throughout New France in the mid-17th century. So right around the same time that Hobbes was working on Leviathan. And this timeline is going to be interesting to you, because this timeline of Candironk kind of pre-exists before the Enlightenment, really. And it's going to be interesting because he had a lot of real Enlightenment-like ideas. Okay. After he was interviewed and debated, Candironk, by a French aristocrat named Louis Amand de l'Homme de Darc Baron de Hauton, I don't know, and a Catholic priest, Father Chirovets, another name, I don't know, I'm sure I butchered it. Candironk had previous experience within modern civilization as he visited France with 2 or 3 other tribal members earlier in his life. He made it very clear that he was not a fan of modern civilization, as modern civilization enslaves the individual to his property, gold, the law, other men, and religion. This is important to think about here, because you're talking about so earlier in his life. So in the early 1600s, Candironk and a few others were ambassadors over in Europe as members of the Huron, which is a Great Lakes Native American tribe. Does anybody that's listening to this know that Native Americans had international ambassadors in the freaking 1600s that were traveling over to Europe and seeing like what this whole government thing is, what states are, what money is, what currency is, what religion is, what rights mean. We had the Native Americans were sending people over there for hundreds of years before the American Revolution, which also makes you think that the Native Americans had a pretty good idea about what democracy and European government and religion and law looked like well before the Indian Wars. And they didn't want any part of it at all. As a matter of fact, here is a pretty long quote from Candy Ronk himself, which would have been, like I said, in the mid-1600s. Quote, "For my own part, I find it hard to see how you could be much more miserable than you already are. What kind of human, what species of creature must Europeans be, that they have to be forced to do good and only refrain from evil because of fear of punishment, because of fear of God? You have observed that we lack judges. What is the reason for that? Well, we never bring lawsuits against one another. And why do we never bring lawsuits? Well, because we made a decision neither to accept or make use of money. And why do we refuse to allow money into our communities? The reason is this. We are determined not to have laws, because since the world was a world, our ancestors have been able to live contently without them. I have spent 6 years reflecting on the state of European society, and I still can't think of a single way they act that is not inhuman. And I genuinely think this can only be the case as long as you stick to your distinctions of mine and thine. I affirm that what you call money is the devil of devils, the tyrant of the French, the source of all evils, the bane of souls, and the slaughterhouse of the living. To imagine one can live in a country of money and preserve one's soul is like imagining one could preserve one's life at the bottom of a lake. Money is the father of luxury, intrigues, trickery, lies, betrayal, insincerity, and of all the world's worst behavior. Fathers will sell their children. Husbands will sell their wives. Wives will betray their husbands. Brothers will kill each other. Friends will become false. And all because of money. In the light of all this, tell me that we, the Wendat, are not right in refusing to touch or so much as even look at silver." That's a hell of a, for a savage in the mid-1600s, that's a hell of a way to talk. Those are the words of an extremely enlightened and very intelligent and very well-traveled, cultured human being right there. Candy Ronk. I highly recommend looking into that guy, okay? This was an extensive quote from Candy Ronk detailing why his people would not accept Christianity or physical currency. Graeber does well pointing out that these thoughts predate the American Revolution by at least 100 years, at least probably longer. When Candy Ronk's words were published throughout France, Europe, and Britain, it led many to question the true savagery of the Native Americans. As many prominent European thinkers discredited Candy Ronk intentionally for this very reason, even going so far as to say that he did not have the capability, the understanding, the awareness, the intelligence to express those kind of beliefs. Might have something to do with skin color to think that he's not capable of expressing those kinds of beliefs. Gruber believes that Candy Ronk was the real inspiration behind the Enlightenment period, like we were kind of talking about earlier. And his ideals came before prominent Enlightenment thinkers, such as the individuals that I mentioned earlier, and seem to have been plagiarized even to some extent in some of their work. Gruber's work is excellent, very thought-provoking, and explores the ideas of prominent Native American leaders in early America. It's absolutely worth exploring. The intellectual foundation of liberty and the American Democratic Republic has been somewhat explored. All right, now we're going to investigate kind of the tributary reasoning behind why liberty might be the Trojan horse towards death and enslavement in some respects. After the United States gained its independence and forged its founding ideals into the bedrock of American liberty, which is the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it was time to generate an economy, an American identity. The westward expansion was in full tilt, and settlers were promised free land and economic opportunity. All one needed to do was gather their courage as well as their family and equipment and head west. Meanwhile, Native Americans found themselves on the run, as government officials routinely broke treaties, well, literally every single treaty they ever signed with the Native Americans, and to give settlers more land rights, and African Americans also found themselves enslaved. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, equal protection under the law, representation, and the European idea of liberty had yet to find its way into the lives of Native Americans, African Americans, and women. Not even until women didn't get shit in this country until kind of the beginning of the 20th century, but still like a decade after that. From 1819 to 1969, so from 1819 to 1969, the United States government, along with the Christian church, primarily the Catholic Church, operated and funded at least 408 known Native American boarding schools. Okay, the desired outcome: kill the Indian in him and save the man. Numerous investigations have taken place within the United States and Canada to nail down exactly how many children were murdered in these institutions. The most common number found is 40,000 in each country. I'm going to say that again because nobody knows about this. The most common number found now, and Canada is officially admitted to this, the United States hasn't, is 40,000 kids in each country. We're talking about children here. I think it's important to remember children when children are the ones being destroyed. We need to remember that they're children. That's 80,000 children at least. 2 articles pertaining to this will be investigated. Article number 1, Boarding School Abuses, Human Rights, and Reparations by Andrea Smith. And The American Indian Boarding School Experience, Recent Studies from a Native Perspective by Julie Davis. The methodology associated with both articles is intellectual, political, religious, and indigenous history. The primary questions associated with each article are how and why did the federal government fund institutions as overtly destructive as Indian boarding schools? And how could the federal government, an institution designed to protect civil rights and liberties, right, believe that the ends justified the means? According to the authors, the boarding schools were not officially recognized and funded until the early 19th century. The schools had unofficially been in place since the beginning of the 17th century, which is again the 1600s, when a man named John Eliot in the early 1600s erected what he called praying towns for American Indians, in which he separated them out from their communities, I'm sure not by force, to receive Christian civilizing instruction. Okay? And this is in the early 1600s. The formula of Christian re-education had its roots with the resettling immigrant Puritans of the colonies. These Christian individuals, primarily Protestant, had experience within the English Civil War or Revolution between 1642 and 1651, and were in search of freedom of religion as we see it today, First Amendment, right? Away from the Catholics, resettling in the Americas. Before, during, and after the English Civil War, however, their religious tolerance did not extend past their own noses, as they violently started to force their Christian views, which were Protestant views, on the native inhabitants of the Americas, and eventually would become the Catholic views. Now, we'll do a little quick distinction here on the Protestants and the Catholics, okay? What kind of separated them in Europe and caused a lot of Protestants and Catholics to kill each other by the hundreds and thousands was the separation in ideologies. Okay, the Catholics believed in rigid, old school, fundamental Catholic ideology. Latin Mass, kind of an uninformed public, right? You didn't get your own Bible. You weren't able to interpret biblical scripture or prophecy or works or prophets or anything. You were kind of told what to think, and you had to absorb that and accept it. And if you question the narrative, you got burned at the stake. That's what happened, right? Protestants are different in that respect. The Protestants believed in reason. Deism, for example, which a lot of the founding fathers are believed to be deists, is Protestant, and that's the kind of a believer in reason. All right, this started with the Magna Carta and John Wycliffe, which we'll go into in here in a little bit. But the Protestants believed in reason. They believed in man's intellectual ability to understand. So how they separated, and they killed each other over this a lot, was the Protestants wanted people to be able to have their own Bibles. They wanted them to be educated. They wanted them to be able to read. They wanted them to use their reason to interpret their own values for their families and what they believed to be important and what needed to be focused on. That's how the Protestants and the Catholics separated. The Protestants were much more kind of free and open, and reason played a huge role. That's why reason is so important within the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And we talk about reason, and we talk about the Enlightenment, and that you're supposed to be able, as humanity, as a society, as a culture, to think independently, to have independent thoughts and analysis. That is reason. And that's where the Protestants and the Catholics separated. From the early 17th century to the mid 20th century, around 360 years, the ends justified the means, according to the Canadian and United States government. Okay, we're going back to the Indian boarding schools here. So for 360 years, the ends justified the means. That's a lot. That's 360 years of boarding schools, from the praying towns all the way up until when it was technically eliminated. That's a hell of a long time. According to the authors, even after all these years later, it is extraordinarily difficult to get any support from the federal government and or the Christian or Catholic Church to investigate the crimes associated with these schools. And the 80,000 dead children that were in these schools, 80,000 dead children that were in these schools, were adult human being, religious people killed them. And before they killed them, they probably executed other horrific tasks upon them as well. All right. One of the most troubling outcomes the authors found was that the natives had been advised or discouraged against pursuing individual lawsuits against the church. And the reasoning behind this was twofold, directly from the church. Number one, this can lead to a loss of allies for the tribe, as Christian churches attempt to support native peoples. This is the church telling the tribe that you could lose our support if you do this. Number two, many Christian fundamentalist churches that actively oppose native sovereignty are using this struggle to say that since they were not involved in boarding schools, native people should join their churches. That's a really interesting argument. So you have other churches that are coming out and saying, since we're not the Catholic Church or the Christian Church, and we didn't kill 80,000 of your children, you should just use that as an example to come join our church. I don't know. Maybe, I'm sure it probably works. Articles like these are becoming more and more common as the investigation into the international mistreatment of Native American children continues and becomes more and more horrifying. Indian boarding schools are another example of weaponized liberty. In order to Americanize the Americas, it became necessary to violently eliminate the language, religion, customs, and family groups of native peoples, while simultaneously acquiring their land. All right. Though we primarily investigate how liberty killed and enslaved kind of native peoples, the plight of the Native Americans or the African slaves isn't going to be overlooked either. Okay, we're going to get into that right now. Coffee break. All right. During the American Civil War, many African and American-born slaves volunteered to fight. As a matter of fact, 200,000 of them volunteered to fight. They were not promised anything. They were promised no things by the United States government. They were not promised freedom or land or rights outside of their individual belief in fighting for the end of enslavement. That's what these 200,000 individuals fought for. The idea of the belief of the end of enslavement. They weren't treated well in the Union Army. Make no mistake at all. In order to better understand the plight of African American citizenship, or lack thereof, we will investigate Black Americans versus citizenship, the Dred Scott decision. Like the Supreme Court, man. We're going to go over some Supreme Court stuff. You're going to find out the Supreme Court is not the friend of the people, okay? Especially groups, certain groups. Okay. Here, the author investigates the political history associated with the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott v. Sandford. This court case was in 1857. Okay, 1857. Findings of the court, quote, the United States Supreme Court held that the U.S. Constitution did not extend American citizenship to people of Black African descent, and therefore they could not enjoy the rights and privileges the Constitution conferred upon American citizens. I'll say that again, quote, the Dred Scott decision, U.S. Supreme Court, 1857. The United States Supreme Court that held that the U.S. Constitution did not extend American citizenship to people of Black African descent, and therefore they could not enjoy the rights and privileges the Constitution conferred upon American citizens, even though they were American citizens. Unfortunately, for those of African descent, this was just the beginning of overt racial discrimination. This is kind of just the beginning of it, displayed by the institution, judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, that was supposed to grant and defend humanity's rights to equal protection under the law, equal protection under the law, equal protection under the law. Every old document talks about it. You do not have a democracy, a republic. You do not have liberty. You do not have freedom if you do not have equal protection under the law. If one person is going to get favoritism over another human being, you do not have liberty, as expressed through the ideals of liberty and the separation of power. According to that author, going back to the article, there was one positive outcome associated with this ruling of the Dred Scott case, and that was unifying the Northern abolitionists. The outcome of this case helped to ignite the Civil War. So if you could think about the Civil War being a good outcome, which eventually led to the elimination of slavery, that's what the Dred Scott case pushed America towards that outcome. That was the good thing about that decision. This article, like the others before, has become much more mainstream, especially after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the elimination of Jim Crow laws that were again approved by the U.S. Supreme Court. Jim Crow was approved by the U.S. Supreme Court. We're going to go into more of these cases here in a minute. One of the primary ideals of liberty, if not the primary idea of liberty, was equal protection under the law. As I said, as kings and priests should be held to the same legal standards as the average citizen and or peasant. Okay? From the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 to the writings of John Wycliffe in the mid-14th century, the mid-1300s, to the English and American revolutions, liberty could not be obtained without equal protection for all under the law. However, more important than equal protection under the law was economics and land. Before we get to that, the Magna Carta and John Wycliffe. The Magna Carta was our first known attempt at actual liberty or freedom, state-sponsored liberty or freedom or protection under the law. The Magna Carta came about when there was a war between, God, I can't try to remember Charles I. I can't remember the king. Brain farting this right now. Anyway, there was a ceasefire, and the agreement was basically the king agreeing that the peasantry would be held, that they'd have the same legal protections basically as the king. And it was written out, and it was called the Magna Carta, and it was kind of the first known liberty document statement that was made and ratified kind of into law. John Wycliffe in the mid 1300s would have been like one of the first Protestants, right? He expressed the ideals of reason and understanding and intellectualism and education, and said that every human being should be able to come up with his or her own conclusions based on their own intellect and reason, and should have their own Bibles and should be able to interpret the Bibles themselves and interpret the history themselves without priests, without the church. After he was killed, the Catholic Church dug up his body, they ripped it up into a whole bunch of pieces, and they threw all of his bones and pieces into a river. Yep. How dare he have those opinions? Okay, so now to economics and land. All right. For us to better understand how the judicial branch, Supreme Court, has been weaponized as a tool for economics and land at the expense of the lives of Native Americans, African Americans, and yes, women, as I said before, women, no rights, we will examine legal issues and homeland security, U.S. Supreme Court cases by Terrence Dower. Here, the author primarily focuses on political history as a methodology and attempts to answer or explain historic Supreme Court decisions. The case of Dred Scott was explored earlier. It was already investigated. We'll go into some other outcomes. For example, the cases that fly in the face of the slave amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, known as the slave amendments. For example, Pelzey versus Ferguson, 1896. Here, this is the Dred Scott case. So this is in 1896. Here, the Supreme Court famously ruled separate but equal. Separate but equal. That's important. Okay, granting states the ability through federalism, which is the 10th Amendment. Right, anything not written out in the Constitution is designated over to the states, to overtly discriminate against African American citizens through Jim Crow laws. All right, so through federalism, state by state basis, there were certain states, obviously, that didn't incorporate these thoughts. This is what separated. This is why, blacks couldn't go into the same schools, couldn't drink out of the same water fountain, couldn't ride in the front of the buses, weren't able to have certain rights and privileges that, when they were in court, they had to go up into the balcony and couldn't be down at the bottom. This was all Jim Crow, right? And Jim Crow stayed in place until the freaking 1960s. To the mid-1960s. Here's another good one. Korematsu versus United States, 1944. Here, the Supreme Court ruled that that it was constitutional, to indefinitely imprison Americans of Japanese descent without charges, in turn stealing their property and economic viability. Okay. Context. Pearl Harbor. So, after Pearl Harbor, the American government decided that you could kind of Americanize it more to our generation. Think about 9/11. It'd be like if the American government just took every single Muslim or Middle Easterner or whatever. Maybe, you could be an atheist Middle Eastern man that's just of Arab descent that's not Muslim. And the American government would take all of them, all over the country, and then take away not let them have jobs, take away whatever land that they had bought and invested in, including vehicles and everything else, and then throw them all into a camp throughout the war, through the duration. That's what happened with the Japanese internment camps during World War II. Japanese Americans were, a lot of Japanese Americans who had never even been to Japan, were born in America, that didn't speak any Japanese. They had lost their property, their jobs, and they were thrust into concentration camps. And quite frankly, they were treated a lot worse than the Nazi POWs that we had in kind of the heartland of America that were brought over via ship and plane after they were captured on the field of battle. And they were in the heartland. They were able to, go into town and eat cafes and kind of mingle and stuff. And the Japanese Americans that were in the internment camps had less rights than those Nazi soldiers who were POWs. All right, so here's another one. Buck v. Bell. Buck versus Bell, 1927. Here the Supreme Court ruled in favor of eugenics. granting the state the ability to forcefully sterilize the unfit, disabled, and imbeciles for the protection of the state. 1927, eugenics. Everybody thinks when they think of eugenics, what do you think of? You think of Nazi Germany, right? That's eugenics. So everybody thinks of. Wrong. Everybody was involved in eugenics. The United States was involved in eugenics. Great Britain was involved in eugenics. France was involved in eugenics. Everybody was involved in eugenics. Everybody. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court in 1927 said that it was just fine to go ahead and sterilize anybody who the court determined to be unfit, disabled, or an imbecile. I feel like that's pretty open to interpretation. Another questionable ruling was this one, which pretty much gave the Obama administration the green light to kill American citizens overseas without due process. In other words, if you were an American citizen and you were deemed an enemy combatant by the president, then you at that time could just be executed. No due process. In other words, no representation, no Bill of Rights. You just had to have a member of the president or the president, basically, the member of the administration say that you're an enemy combatant. So this particular case, this is on November 8th, 2010. We'll go over this really quick because this is important. This is the Supreme Court. These are your rights. This is what sets precedent. All right. The Obama administration today argued before a federal court that it should have unreviewable authority to kill Americans. The executive branch has unilaterally determined to pose a threat. So, kill Americans that the executive branch has unilaterally determined to pose a threat. Government lawyers made the claim in response to a lawsuit brought by the American Civil Liberties Union and the Center for Constitutional Rights, the CCR, charging that the administration's asserted targeted killing authority violates the Constitution and international law. The U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia heard arguments from both sides today. Quote, not only does the administration claim to have sweeping power to target and kill U.S. citizens anywhere in the world, but it makes the extraordinary claim that the court has no role in reviewing that power or the legal standards that apply. The Supreme Court has repeatedly rejected the government's claim to an unchecked system of global detention. And the district court should similarly reject the administration's claim here to an unchecked system of global targeted killing, especially of American citizens. This came after a man named Anwar al-Awlaki was drone stroked to death. He was an American citizen. His father, Nasser, brought this lawsuit in this case to the Supreme Court after his son was killed without due process. If the Constitution means anything, quote, if the Constitution means anything, it surely means that the president does not have unreviewable authority to similarly execute any American whom he concludes is an enemy of the state. It is the government's responsibility to protect the nation from terrorist attacks, but the courts have a critical role to play in ensuring that counterterrorism policies are consistent with the U.S. Constitution. Well, guess what? We can kill American citizens over now without due process. All right. So that book has become pretty mainstream. About the Supreme Court and is required reading for many universities, especially in law, to explore all court cases associated with Homeland Security and court precedent. The book's outstanding, provides incredible detail. As previously investigated the case of Dred Scott. Anyway, the case for liberty cannot exist without equal protection for all under the law. The case for liberty, if liberty is supposed to be what we says it is, if liberty is supposed to be what we thinks it is, then the case of liberty cannot exist without equal protection for all under the law. Whether you're living in Compton or South Chicago, or you're part of the Lucky Sperm Club in Nantucket, it shouldn't mean a damn. It should be everything. If it is not exactly equal, and it's not, it is not. Our legal system is not equal. It's about who can hire the biggest lawyers and push those court dates out the furthest. biggest lawyers push those court dates out the furthest, those are the people that are going to win. If the Supreme Court of the United States, or any court within the United States for that matter, can be corrupted in any way, the very idea of liberty is dead. 100%. All right. Without getting too much more into the weeds, appreciate y'all. Hope you enjoyed this. I'll come out with something again next week. Who the hell knows? Come up with something. Have a good day.